Good morning. So it's great to have this last, although not least, because it actually relies upon a lot of the stuff that we've already heard about, particularly with at all of the different stages of production that actually go into determining the supply of biomass and biofuels, as well as thinking about the demand. Okay, so the types of questions that our group tries to analyze are first and foremost sort of looking at the supply side of biofuel production and the components of that. And so in particular in CABBI, we are interested in looking at which bioenergy crops are going to be adopted by landowners. So thinking about this outside the field experiments and the labs and taking this into the real world and looking into which crops farmers are more likely to grow, how much land are they going to be willing to convert from whatever existing use they might be putting that land into, which may be row crops, or it may be pasture or idle and so on. And then which land is going to be converted and where is that land located? If we're looking at the rain-fed region, that's a pretty large area. So where in particular and which regions are most favorable to growing these types of energy crops? And then scaling it up from that to thinking about what are the economy-wide implications if we were to in fact meet the goals of our policies, like the 16 billion gallons of biofuel production or 36 billion gallons, all including corn ethanol. What are going to be the implications of taking the land out in order to produce that on prices of the things that we care about, food and fuel in particular, and what are going to be the economic impacts for agricultural producers as well as fuel producers, fuel consumers, agriculture consumers, and so on. And then it's not enough to just look at, can we produce this and at what cost and where, but really can we consume it? And one of the big problems that we have currently in the US is that we have capped out in our ability to consume biofuels at 10%, which is what our conventional cars can accommodate, and maybe we can go up to 15%. But in order to be able to consume 36 billion gallons, we need to be able to blend about 20-25% of biofuel with gasoline. And that requires that we need to move beyond conventional vehicles to flex fuel cars, or we need to be able to produce drop-in fuels that do not require different types of engines. And so how do we think about, what are the factors that are going to lead us into being able to consume these higher blends? What sort of infrastructure do we need? How do we price the higher blends in order to be able to get consumers to purchase them? And then we also want to look at the environmental and the ecosystem benefits that we can get, and how does that translate back into incentives for producers to provide them. And so, environmental services, although we all enjoy them, but when we think about farmers and even us as consumers, we care more about our self-interest, and we're often thinking about our economic benefits and not about the impact to the larger environment. And so one of the things we study is what is the value or the monetized dollar value of these ecosystem services. For example, greenhouse gas mitigation, or as Andy showed, reducing the nitrogen and nutrient loss going into the Gulf of Mexico. And then once we've monetized that, how do we actually incentivize consumers and producers in order to provide some of these services so that it actually becomes part of their own self-interest? So if we were to, for example, tax carbon and make gasoline more expensive, then it would create incentives to use more renewable fuel. Another question that we are interested in looking at is which land should be converted to producing energy crops if we want to achieve certain environmental targets, such as greenhouse gas reduction in order to keep to the 2-degree target, or if we want to reduce the size of the hypoxic zone. And then finally, what kind of policies would be most appropriate in order to achieve those sort of goals? So at a really high level, and I'm going to just sort of focus on a couple of the building blocks for the economic analysis that we do, and really address it as just the first question, which is which crops are likely to be grown and where, and what is needed for just basic economic sustainability of bioenergy crop production. And so in order to do that, we really need to think about what are some of the key distinguishing features of energy crops that we're interested in here. and how would they compare to the existing crops that are being grown by farmers, the conventional row crops. And so there's sort of a few, real, the 30,000-foot level differences between them that become really important from an economic perspective. And one of these is that perennials, by their very nature, are long-lived, and they have lifespans of 10 to 15 years. Unlike annual crops that farmers grow one year, in the year, they harvest them, and next year they have the flexibility to use their land for anything else that they might want to do with it. Here they are actually stuck with it, and they need a long-term commitment and wait for 15 years to get the returns from their planting. A second feature of these crops, unlike with row crops, is that they have, some of them, at least like miscanthus, has very high fixed costs of establishing them. And there is some risk that these crops may not all emerge back, the next year. And so, so there's a lot of upfront investment, and there may be no return in the first year or even in the first 2 years. So you have to wait for at least 3 years in the case of miscanthus before you're going to get that return. And then you have to wait for about 15 years to really recover your full investment. And then a fourth feature is that you can grow these productively on less fertile land. And so unlike row crops, there is a possibility that you could actually grow them on less productive land. So in thinking about what goes into an economic analysis, and there's three main things that are central to our analysis. And the first thing we start with is thinking about the decision rule. What is a farmer seeking to what is the objectives of the landowner from their land? And of course that varies across people and is complex and so on. But we start out with some stylized assumptions, and we look at how differences in their objectives can make a difference to their incentives to produce these types of crops. And so the first of these is the farmer interested in maximizing the return from their land, which is a pretty reasonable assumption. If you talk to most farmers, that's what they really, they want. This is their source of income. But then some farmers may be very risk averse, and they may care not only about the return they may get on average in a given year or over a 15-year period, but they care about the returns, but the variability in those returns from one year to the next. And they don't want to see variability. They'd rather have a constant, certain income over time rather than ups and downs from year to year. And so if they're risk averse, they're going to take the variability in returns from year to year into account. Other farmers may not so much care about the upside benefits, but they may really not like the downside risks, and so they want to minimize the possibility of losses. And then the last one is, what is the value that farmers are placing or the compensation that they're getting for providing ecosystem services? And in the absence of policy incentives, those might often be pretty small. A second feature that's really underlying everything we do is this notion of opportunity cost, and that is, what is the alternative use that they could have, the best alternative use they could have put that land in, and that's the foregone profits. When they convert land from one use to another, what are the profits they're giving up in order to do that? And that really is part of the cost of converting land from an existing use to an energy crop. And you would expect that these costs would be higher on more productive land, because that land is going to be more profitable to grow things like corn and soybeans. And it would also be much higher for energy crops. This is like a fixed cost. The dollars per acre that the farmer is giving up, it's like a fixed cost. And so the lower the yield of an energy crop, the higher the opportunity cost per ton. And that's why yield of energy crops is really very important in determining its economic sustainability. And so we think that miscanthus, that has twice as high yield in most places than switchgrass, is going to be much more preferred as an energy crop. And then the third thing that becomes important in the case of energy crops is notion of discount rate. And the discount rate arises because there are upfront costs and the returns come over a period of time. And so $1 of costs today is not equal to $1 of return tomorrow, because you could take that dollar and put it in the bank and you could earn an interest on it. And so, if you did that, your money would be increasing, and you cannot just treat $1 today as equal to $1 tomorrow. So, and so we have to take into account what is the trade-off that farmers are willing to make. And our survey suggests suggests that actually farmers are very much present biased, and they care about returns today rather than waiting, and their trade-off rates are actually much higher than the interest rates you would get in a bank, and could be as high as 20% or 30%, which just means that they expect much higher returns than they would get from putting the money in the bank when they convert to energy crops. And so the more impatient the landowners are, the more they're likely to prefer annual crops to perennial crops. So in doing this sort of farm-scale economic analysis, there's several components to it. The first is a techno-economic analysis that, you take into account all the biophysical information, the agronomic information, what inputs, what crop management decisions are being made, what are the prices and the costs of those inputs. We take into account and we quantify and value the ecosystem services, the soil carbon, the hydrological impacts, the life cycle emission reduction that you get. And then you can value these using things like the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon is just the monetized value of $1 of CO2 emitted in terms of the global damages that it is expected to cause. And similarly, there is a social cost of nutrient loss that can convert every ton of nutrient loss that occurs in terms of the ecosystem damages that it causes. And based on that, you can determine the minimum price that a farmer would need in order to convert their land from a row crop or from pasture into an energy crop. And we can also determine the profits they would get at different levels of biomass prices. And so this is sort of just an example of the type of information, and this is where we economists can, working in this area cannot work in isolation. We then have to go talk to our other colleagues in CABBI, and so we're going to talk to Tom Boyd or DK Lee to understand the agronomics of growing these crops. What are the different stages of the production? How much of inputs should be applied? And then convert that into monetary values to understand the prices, and so understanding the entire supply chain of going from planting to production, and then actually even beyond that within the refinery, and actually producing the fuel. We look at the entire supply chain, every stage of that process, and look at the costs of that. And then we talk to other people in the ecosystem modeling group to understand the ecosystem services that come out, in particular that box at the bottom of all the services that we care about, how much are those, in terms of physical quantities, and then in terms of monetary values. And when we do that, then we can look at a particular location, say in Champaign County, what would it cost to produce miscanthus versus switchgrass, and understand what are the things that determine those costs. And so you can see, switchgrass would be much more expensive. A large part of that expense is really the cost of land that comes because of the lower yield of switchgrass relative to miscanthus. But in the case of miscanthus, these establishment costs are much more than in the case of switchgrass. And so if a farmer just cared about the average return, then they'd go with miscanthus. But if they cared about the fact that the very high discount rates, they may prefer switchgrass because it has lower upfront costs. And so yield matters, as well as these fixed costs, and then the discount rates and the preferences of the farmer in actually determining which grass is going to be grown. And then we want to go beyond one location to look at the heterogeneity in terms of where you might actually grow this. And so we work with the biophysical modelers to look at the yields of switchgrass, miscanthus, and we do that similarly with corn and soybeans and all the alternative uses for this land, to look at the differences across space, north, south, and so on, between these different crops, and that gives us already an idea of what's going to be, where these grasses are going to be more profitable to grow. Then we convert that into the break-even price that would be needed to grow them, and as you can see, the areas that are lighter are the ones where the costs are lower. So depending on if you're if the price of biomass is only $60 a ton, we'd be growing it in only a small part of the south central region of the rain-fed area. As the prices go up, we'd be able to expand the area that could be where it would be more sustainable economically to grow it. And then we want to put all of that together in order to understand, how much total biomass would be produced. So I'm just sort of focused here only on the supply side of this, and essentially this staircase supply curve is, in a simplest sense, could be thought about as just ranking the different counties or locations from least cost to highest cost, and that tells us, which, as the price goes up, you sort of move up the staircase and you bring in more regions into production. And if you were paying farmers for ecosystem services and using subsidies, that supply curve would shift to the right and you could produce more. And so that would tell us, what is the price that needs to be paid in the market if we want to get a certain quantity be produced. And here, of course, we haven't looked into the demand curve, but looking at developing this demand curve is another sort of bioenergy 102, but really looking at, because people don't demand biomass for itself, they demand it because it produces a service, which is it allows you to drive your vehicles and produce vehicle miles and so on. So you have to really derive that demand back from the demand for fuel, and then also, of course, bioproducts in the long run, in order to be able to figure out really what is the demand for biomass. And so that's really what we're doing. This is sort of just the building block of what we do in the economic analysis. And so I'm going to stop with that and see if there are any questions.